manager as the hearing examiner for expedited transfers. So these are the tools that, or the other options that we have, using our tools that we can implement A1. And so along with the 50-year water action plan, I told you that we had hired experts in order to do different sections of the leap ahead analysis, and the information that was collected in the leap ahead analysis formulated the governor's 50-year action water plan. And this is the website here you can go to and look at that plan. It just came out in January of this year. And the key pillars to the action plan include conservation, new water supplies, and watershed and water protection. And so I think I was moving along very fastly because I started late. And so I've come to the last slide of my presentation, but I'm here to take any questions that you might have regarding water administration in New Mexico. Anybody have any questions?
Yes, I was curious. You were talking about storage, dwindling storage options. That's what we're talking about for surface water storage. But at the same time, we're talking about like decreased surface flows and more evaporation. So how did you calculate that the storage is also a problem with the?
I'm saying we don't have storage in a lot of places. Okay. Like, El Vado right now is down. There is no storage for the Middle Rio Grande other than what they've agreed to take storage in other places. But I was just saying in general, storage, yes, the storage is an issue when it comes to trying to administer the water in the field. And, if you don't have, storage available, or your storage that is, or the water that's in storage is being evaporated due to higher temperatures, that these are the challenges that the water masters are overcoming. Yes.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, I was curious, the groundwater administrative boundaries are very different in side. I'm looking at them and I'm just curious how close they match the underlying aquifers, or if they get modified very often when you have new studies. And then I'll leave it there and have some.
Oh well, yes. Let me go back to that slide. So I just yesterday we were meeting. We've got regional water planning efforts as well as this 50-year water plan, where the Interstate Stream Commission is redoing the regulations regarding regional water planning. And even though Estancia Basin, for instance, is delineated here, when they actually showed what the aquifer was, the aquifer is kind of like inside of that. It doesn't really match up, and we're not going to be changing their boundaries. These are kind of driven, the way that they were delineated. I think a lot of it had to do with watersheds, the edges of the watershed more than the aquifer itself. And so, anything on the edges of that Estancia Basin would be flowing in very inward instead of outward. But I also noticed when they were looking at all the watersheds, this lower part here by Encino actually goes down into the Pecos side of things, according to what I was shown yesterday. Yeah, yesterday in that meeting. That's the first thing that came out to me, is that the limits of the aquifer itself was not to the extent of the edges of the groundwater basin. At least for Estancia, I'm kind of zoned in there just because I'm familiar with that area. So, but I did, yes, they are different, definitely different.
So on the Middle Rio Grande, that's a massive area. So if you're putting a well in one place, maybe it wouldn't impact the groundwater basin at large, but it could have a significant impact on maybe the local. I'm kind of curious, being such a big area,
That would be the biggest concern there. And somebody else had their hand up. Yeah.
You mentioned the San Juan Basin.
all of the basins are subject to shortage sharing agreement, and I don't know that there's actually,
The district office would have.
yeah, the district office would probably have that. I don't think there's a place on the website to find those shortage sharing agreements, you know.
It's actually on the Animas River. They have kind of a short sharing agreement. So you call the district office, or I can get it for you. It's not like the short sharing agreement on the Gainas, where it's written out, or the MS, where it's real clear, and triggers. They have some unset triggers over there. But
And is that an ongoing thing? Because in most of the areas, the shortage sharing agreements, okay, they do it every year, okay, because they're always short. Is that,
it's
So-
on the Animas.
so every year they revisit, I know that, at least in the Chama and the Guyanas, you know, but we really push and prefer that users come to an agreement themselves instead of that heavy-handed administration from Santa Fe.
Or something for shortage sharing.
You know,
You just organic, like you're saying.
there is really no framework for it because, yeah, there's not really a framework for it because every stream system has its own unique issues and abilities in order to overcome whatever shortages that they have. Some of them have storage, some don't have storage.
There's sites, you know, for the area, they're built for the area.
But there is there is information here. All of this information, we've got a whole page on active water resource management. So, you know, perhaps there is something in there that might give you a clue. But the areas that you might be interested in looking at other areas, the Guyanas River in Vegas is often got a shortage sharing agreement, and Chama, the Upper Chama, is usually has a shortage sharing agreement besides the Animas. So, you know, those are other opportunities that you can look at, see how they do it in other areas.
You know, the Yetton Center might have some information on this, because they were looking at this and studying this about a year ago. They might have something you want to check with them.
But I thank you very much for your time, and then next up is Katie.
While she's getting set up, the question about aquifer boundaries. That the Bureau of Geology is working on a project right now with the Office of the State Engineer to better define the extents of those boundaries, because really right now we have mostly, let's get USGS major aquifer delineations, which leaves most of the state blank. So it's partially not well defined in our state exactly where all those aquifer boundaries are. So it's a project that we're actively working on right now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Zemlick, and I am the Bureau Chief of the Hydrology Bureau at the Office of the State Engineer. And I'm here today to talk about hydrologic models and data needs in New Mexico Office of the State Engineer. I've given a presentation like this many times, but it fits into different venues. And I think in terms of looking towards our water future, we always kind of need to be considering the tools that will help us get to where we want to be. So the Hydrology Bureau is a bureau within the Office of the State Engineer. There's about a dozen technical people. We're with WRRI. We collect hydrologic data, create water resources models, assist in policy development and planning, evaluate water availability, provide expert testimony for litigation, and manage technical projects. In terms of sort of the water workforce, bureau hydrologists tend to have at least a master's degree in education, but come from a wide variety of backgrounds, from climate science to engineering to geology, hydrology, geology, and bring a unique set of skills to the group as a whole. So what are the role of hydrologic models at the OSE? Generally, as Jerry was discussing, we need to understand local and regional hydrogeology and spatial and temporal variability and demand for water. So we need to know what our water supplies look like and how they compare to demand on that water. So basically, when evaluating applications, we need to understand how changes in groundwater use affect other groundwater users. So whether it's a new appropriation or a change in point of diversion, how that would affect existing wells or water right owners in the area. So how do changes in groundwater use affect stream flow? including other surface users, surface supply in general, and interstate stream compact deliveries. And then how have surface water supplies changed over time? And this is becoming an area of increasing interest in New Mexico as we experience the consequences of climate change. So how have historic supplies and the availability of those supplies to meet demand in the past, how have they changed into the future? So for this, we use hydrologic models. So this is a generally USGS representation of a hydrologic system. We need to understand as best as we can mass balance, how much water is available, how much water we're using, interactions between surface water and groundwater, with the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of moving pieces to understand the system as a whole. And we have different methods for doing so. A lot of that depends on what data we have available and what questions we want to address. Depending on that sort of dictates what tools or models we would use. So the first tool is analytical tools. The Tice equation for understanding effects on groundwater, C.D. Tice, developed in New Mexico almost 100 years ago. And the Glover-Balmer method used to determine what effects might be on surface water. So analytical tools are advantageous because they're usually provide one solution. You need a limited amount of data, but there's a lot of assumptions that go into them. So on here, I have the assumptions about a confined aquifer that's homogeneous, which almost never exists, horizontal flow, and with Glover-Balmer that you have an aquifer that's fully connected to a stream. But these can be useful in determining what potential worst case scenario effects could be. They can be done fairly quickly. So even though one simulation would deliver one solution, you can test the sensitivity of an aquifer to your application, whether or not you have conservative enough aquifer properties to sort of capture what the worst case might be. Because at the OSE, we're not worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. We're often worried about what's going to happen 40, 100 years from now. And so often application of these types of methods does involve multiple simulations just to make sure we're capturing potential variability within the system. This is an example of this Tice analysis spreadsheet that's been developed over probably the last 15 years at OSE. This is the latest iteration of it. And so in this round, you can involve background pumping, which is often a really critical determination in whether or not an application will pass, because the effects on the aquifer are really determined by use as a whole. And so when you see hydrographs in eastern New Mexico, those levels of decline are driven by pumping at a large scale. And so whether or not another application is going to pass, in large part is determined by the health of the aquifer as a whole, and then the incidental drawdown or depletion caused by that application. And so just another example of the things that it considers in terms of no flow boundary conditions rotated around the rut wells. So this was an advancement to what we had currently. And as I'll talk about in the future, in the next few slides, sort of our desire to move towards modeling approaches that are easily understood, that have interfaces that once you get used to them, you can go back and understand them again without going back to a manual or something like that. So in this case, a no flow boundary condition would have the effect of concentrating drawdown rather than allowing it to extend out and attenuate at the boundaries. So we had analytical methods, and prior to the development of ModFlow in the early 80s, the OSE would use those analytical methods in what's called block administration. So you split up an aquifer or approximate aquifer boundaries into blocks, and then in each individual block, you determine how much water is available. And it's sort of an accounting system, as we have 100 acre-feet available here. This is the limit to water use in that area. Well, with the advent of ModFlow, you're able to do that much more dynamically. And our administrative models, these blue models are kind of widely accepted administrative models, so a little bit dated. We have some that are in development, but administrative models tend to start as calibrated groundwater models, numerical models that have steady state simulation. They have the conceptual model is well described, delineated based on geology. You have from the steady state, dynamic pumping, and a calibration process that occurs. And once sort of it's widely accepted that the basin is understood, that can be used as a administrative model. And then even though it's second here, that involves basin-specific guidelines. And typically basin-specific guidelines, the specific part is how much drawdown can the aquifer handle. And that is largely dependent on the characteristics of the aquifer, how thick it is, how much existing drawdown there is. But this is very intensive. It requires a lot of data that we're always reiterating through. Leila mentioned aquifer boundaries. So a lot of this mapping has happened fairly recently in southeastern New Mexico. And so these models are moving targets, and we're always looking to improve them and expand them where they're needed. So the general process is you develop the conceptual model, you figure out what the boundaries of the aquifer are. I mean, the fact that we're still talking about two-dimensional boundaries kind of illustrates this problem, as it's not an easy thing to delineate. You have to have adequate geology in order to represent that framework in your numerical model. Boundary conditions, we often have this debate about whether it's a no flow boundary or whether it's an encouraging flow boundary fault. So worst case is sometimes that it's a no flow boundary. Sometimes that's not the worst case. So representing those boundary conditions, calibration, which requires a lot of calibration targets, typically water level measurements. And I think if you've heard Stacy Timmons talks over the years, you know that data is pretty scarce, especially over useful periods of time. And then you calibrate, you verify the model, and then typically you continue to modify it over time, update it, the well file, pumping stresses, and things like that. But it does require a significant amount of resources, expertise, time, and data. Which brings me into the data part. Because I don't think we're ever going to be there where all of this stuff is taken care of, but in this iterative process, the data needs that we need to build these models to perform sort of the decision support services that they can are many. So the first is geologic framework data. New Mexico Bureau of Geology has been just leading the way on this in terms of aquifer mapping. We use a lot of USGS data, the Texas Water Development Board, published reports, oil and gas wells, although the latter is really time intensive if somebody hasn't already done the work. But there's really good coverage of the state, both in terms of completed and ongoing projects in areas where there's a lot of demand. Southeastern New Mexico, big red area is our current area of focus, but we're always updating models in various parts of the state. The other piece of data we need are aquifer properties. And so these are typically aquifer tests conducted by applicants or consultants around the state. You can have sort of general aquifer properties based on the geologic characterization of the aquifer.
Okay, switch on.
But this map on the right was currently released. It's on at the links down there. It's all of the aquifer tests that we have with the Office of the State Engineer, and the Bureau of Geology helped us to clean this up and get it accessible in this web map. The downloads are easy. And so a lot of this can help as another layer of data to characterize your aquifers for your numerical models. Water use data. Most people think where you have a well, you know how much water is used, but that's not always the case. So on the left, you see abstracted areas in New Mexico. Where the blue areas mean that, all of the paperwork for water rights and water use has been ingested in our, NIMWR system, and you can download the reports and you can know how much water is used. So there's still a significant part that is not blue. So there are areas that are incomplete and which you might not know. And so this, I should have picked other colors than blue and black, but you have the blue as wells, and it includes, I believe it includes, wells that may be inactive, but the black is metered wells. And so it's a really small percentage of the total wells. And if you've ever dug into that data, there can be some missing data there. Our bureau has developed a waters to wells program, which takes the raw data of the water rights and the points of diversion and splits and stacks them so we can ingest them into our models, but it's a different data set than metered data. So that's an important consideration in building these models, but one we're working rather constantly to address. We have advances in data like OpenET. So this sort of gives us the ability in some cases, and we're still figuring this out, but if we don't have meter data or we have incomplete meter data for a field, you can at least go and check it and say, does this make sense? Does this sort of check out? The field summaries can be really useful. Our Water Use and Conservation Bureau has been working with NASA and Jet Propulsion Laboratory over the last, I think, 5 or 6 years to do a field scale ET analysis. But this is just like another tool in the toolbox to try and close some of the gaps that we have in our existing data. Water level data. So what we have on the left-hand side, those red dots are really just initial water level data. When a well is drilled, typically the depth of the well is reported, water first encountered is reported, and that's what we go by in terms of determining saturated thickness. And the more time that goes by, sometimes the less valuable that initial depth water can be. And you can see too that on the right-hand graph is that there was significant water data collection, but 25% of our measurements are less than 20 years old, and 8% are less than 10 years old. So that's still a significant amount, 65% that are older than 20 years old that we have. This is just an illustration of water level data USGS on the left. Concentrated in, you see the Eastern Plains, City of Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and then the Healy network that the Bureau of Geology has been putting together. It's pretty sparse. I mean, some of those dots look close together, but for a big state that's more reliant on groundwater than we are on surface water, we don't have a really good idea of what water levels are doing all over the state. So just to highlight some of the things that our Bureau is looking forward to in terms of data and modeling, I just wanted to highlight a few projects that we have that are going on currently. So Jerry, you've mentioned changes in surface runoff.
Can you hear me?
Yes. So this is a project that we've just engaged in with the Propulsion Laboratory and NASA and CU Boulder, which is to use their snowmelt predictions.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is that in your method and your research, did you measure the resilience and if yes, how did you plan to increase?
Whoever's asking that question has a mic. Can you please stop me?
It's the question microphone is what it sounds like. That was a question next door.
I didn't quite catch it again.
Wasn't paying attention.
Hello, testing 1, 2.
We can just turn it off. I can yell.
Well, the thing is, it's probably the person's mic.
No, but just turn on.
Their
ours
mic is
first.
connected to us. Oh, well, keep going. Anyone, keep going.
I haven't had that.
Okay, so maybe I'll just try to just turn this off in case I'm connecting with his. So, this is snow water equivalent. It's a 2-year project that we're working on with scientists at CU Boulder, Instar, that's funded by NASA and Jet Propulsion Laboratory to better understand, to develop a tool by which we have regular predictions of snow water equivalent that are available to us in New Mexico, in the Rio Grande. The project in Colorado has been really successful, and so this is out of the Western Water Applications Office, so specifically designed to for application needs. So it's a combination of the CU suite, which is the University of Colorado snow water equivalent, the SWAN suite, and the SNODAS suite. And I think the working title is SWEAT tool, the SWE applications tool. So, you know, we just started, so it might evolve into different. But this is going to be particularly important for modeling in the Middle Rio Grande and understanding what surface water availability will look like in response to snowpack. And another fun tool we have that we just started is through a Water Smart grant. And I mentioned analytical tools in the beginning. And this is called the Statewide Analytical Tool, ANI affectionately. And it's a map-based analytical tool for probably most of the state. There will be some areas where it's not appropriate, but it uses the TICE solution and this analytical depletion function, which is sort of a more spatially discretized form of Glover-Balmer. And the idea is this can improve water rights administration for the OSE, but potentially be a valuable tool for our staff when communicating with applicants and stakeholders, and potentially water planning about what the consequences, what the hydrologic consequences of certain decisions may be in the future. And we're working closely with the Bureau of Geology and Aquifer Mapping to sort of integrate all of this data together in a useful tool. And we also have a number of other interfaces in development. Just to reiterate, moving towards something that's more accessible. It's open source developed, so we have the ability to change, incorporate new data, boundaries over time. That's just the shot of the the ANI tool, where you have a move from, move to. I think the question earlier was, what do you do in a big basin? Well, the answer is, if we have a numerical model, we analyze the regional effects, which is the effects on the aquifer using the numerical model. And then a lot of times we will fall back on our analytical tools to evaluate sort of worst case local effects. And local effects are those effects on wells and water rights further ownership. And so the ability to visualize it is, I think, helpful to all of us. I think it expedites the learning curve for people that come and start working for us. And the advantages, like, as I see it, we all like to do a good job. And if you're starting in a new job and it seems overwhelming and you're never going to get it, it's harder to retain those people. So hopefully this will kind of lend itself to that too. Sort of looking ahead, I hope I'm giving you like a different talk on this subject, 10 or 20 years from now, is like the focus on maintenance. We can develop tools in the moment. If we don't maintain them, it's synonymous with infrastructure. They just become less and less useful. If we can try to standardize some of our methods and make them more consistent, I think it helps with such a big state, with such diverse water uses and stakeholders. It really helps. If we can continuously incorporate new information into addressing some of these data gaps, these challenges don't become so insurmountable. I think there's been a focus on our end on accessibility for our staff, for other users, and then building capacity both within our workforce and external to us to implement these types of modeling efforts and data collection. And then I think it all goes towards planning. We have tools so we can plan because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And this is one of the pieces, I think, that can help us get there. Thank
you.
You mentioned your activities in respect to saline water and aquifers. Given that, I guess, the state's long-term plan is to utilize these saline waters. The first question is, what activities for hydrology will undertaking in this area? And then the other area that sort of has concerned me over the last 50 years of this business is a question of determining what constitutes impairment when you have groundwater levels changes. It appears to me that the tendency has been going towards allowing or determining impairment based on what a model shows versus what the administrator determines to be impairment. I've always argued that it would be dangerous to have a model dictate what constitutes impairment in terms of groundwater level changes as a basis for denying the application. This would be the state engineer's decision-making process of what constitutes impairment. Could you discuss those two areas?
Sure, so I guess first I'll take the impairment one, because that's a little bit more nuanced, and then I'll do the brackish groundwater. So it's not a straight, there isn't a decision tree. So there isn't a, you know, a decision tree to follow towards impairment. So hydrology provides an analysis of typically model results, also trends in groundwater levels. Often we incorporate historic supply into our analysis. So we really try and provide a full picture of whatever the possible impacts of the application would be. The Water Rights Division determines impairment. And so the basis for impairment, maybe you can step in if I get this wrong, part of that can be impairment just due to drawdown. And that could be model derived, whether analytical or numerical. It could be public welfare, which those are a little bit newer to us. And it's always at the discretion of the district manager too, or the district office to determine impairment. So we try and give them biggest picture of all, but we as hydrologists don't say this application has caused impairment. So hopefully the combination of sort of the broad level, you know, statewide approach that hydrology can bring is made more robust by the local understanding of what's happening.
To understand, there's no existing policy of state engineer's office that says that your model shows a certain drawdown, the application should be denied.
So we have guidelines, and the guidelines do a couple of different things. The guidelines discuss what is happening regionally. So what the model shows is happening regionally. There's usually incorporation of water level data, like actually on the ground data. And so those regional groundwater level changes have to do with everybody else in the system. And so that paints the picture of what's happening with aquifer. Is we use the term critical, but is existing use causing essentially excessive drawdown in the aquifer? And so guidelines then dictate, based on the saturated thickness of the aquifer, that a certain incremental amount of drawdown may be allowable. And sometimes there are discussions over what's the appropriate saturated thickness, what's the appropriate timeline to evaluate those background effects. And so it's, when I say there's no policy, there's guidelines, there's regional guidelines that we try, the regional guidelines try and coalesce more regional information into that decision-making structure. I don't know if that.
I guess my concern is that we don't have AL driving water rights administration in the future. You know where I'm headed. Now, the other question about your involvement in saline groundwater aquifers and identifying them. Where is
We
haven't declared the basins yet.
Yeah, so Jerry just said, we haven't declared brackish groundwater basins yet. We do I can speak for hydrology and for our involvement with statewide, so. When an application comes in for, a deep brackish well, we do have some models in place. Like the San Juan Basin is pretty well understood stratigraphically, somewhat hydrologically. We have some models in place to be able to evaluate the impacts of a proposed application. But in terms of characterizing how much is there, we don't do that with fresh aquifers. So, our concerns at the moment tend to be, how might a brackish water, pumping from a brackish water aquifer affect existing surface water users, existing groundwater users?
Ron, can I ask you a question? This is the first, since I left, the state engineer does have some jurisdiction in, at least in terms of filing applications for saving groundwater use in West. How's that program coming along, and has the state engineer issued approvals of some of those filings?
We do have a program, we have issued some NOIs, some wells have been drilled. And that goes through my statewide program, Jerry helps with that. We haven't, as Jerry said, we haven't declared any of those deep brackish aquifers. So there's some statutes, it's 70 statutes.
72, 12, 25 through 28.
Yes, so we follow those, and we have some rules, right, or some guidelines.
Guidelines.
We follow, and they're on our website. But we've seen maybe 39 wells drilled, some of them are old oil wells. And there's been some new ones, they're very expensive, like a couple of $1 million wells, so that's been prohibited, a lot of these wells being drilled. And they're being drilled by mostly oil and gas to use that brackish water for fracking.
Do you see this area of activity increasing based on development's plan to use brackish water in the future?
It could, if there's incentive for them to tap this deep brackish aquifers and use this water, clean it, and use it for supplies. It really could explode more than what it has already, but it's still very expensive to drill those wells. And these, we're talking, 2,000 foot, 3,000 feet deep wells. And the corrosiveness of that water, you have to stainless steel casing, it's really expensive. So I see you gotta try to factor that in, and that's gonna be the big issue. The expense of cleaning it and building the wells versus what you get in clean water that you use for even potable to that, So it's gonna be interesting.
I hate to prolong this, but given that statement, there's been some discussion in state government subsidizing some of this expensive well drilling in order to tap the resource.
I think that's part of what's in the proposed bills that I've seen the last legislative session and even in this session. I haven't been too involved in, reading every part of it, but I think that's some of the incentive to help pay for that exploration and drilling of the wells and construction of the wells. So then the water can be used for whatever. It's gonna be interesting.
Question, kind of go back to modeling, I'm curious.
Areas where we don't have as much data, I'm always a little hesitant because it's like you're piling uncertainty on top of uncertainty, and why don't we just stick with the analytical tool? But we are experimenting a lot with that. We're doing a lot of remote sensing work. We're doing some gravity modeling, also to try and get a handle on groundwater level changes. So anything that looks like it might work, we are trying, yeah. But the historic supply is the most recent one.
All right, good morning. I'm Judge Manny Arrieta. I'm a water law judge from the Lower Rio Grande District, which means Las Cruces. I'm gonna go ahead and pinch hit for Adrian. We've got some technical issues. Maybe that'll give me more time than what I wanted, but that's okay, I may need it. And before I start, I always ask this question, are there any lawyers in this room? Just 1, 2, 3, okay. hopefully I won't get too many difficult legal issues or questions. As I said, I'm the water judge for the district of the Rio Grande, which is down in Diana County. There are 13 water judges in the state of New Mexico and been appointed by the Supreme Court. I'll explain in a few minutes what we do as water judges, but I am also the designated climate science judge for New Mexico. In 2022, the Environmental Law Institute had a program where they wanted to bring the judiciary up to speed on climate change and the evolving legal issues. And based on what I've heard so far, and in speaking with a lot of people, those issues are at the forefront here. We've been talking a lot about floods, about fires, about those kind of things. And from a legal perspective, it's a question of how are we going to handle the issues that come up. So from time to time, I may take off my water law judge hat and put on my climate science hat. And I'll be switching back and forth in this presentation. All right, what I'm going to talk about is a legal perspective of water administration. We've all sat around here and we've talked about the technical issues, science issues, engineering issues. We've talked about what OSC is doing, we've talked about conservation groups, research and development with the universities. We're all speaking the same language, doing a few little different things, but mine is a legal perspective. So hopefully if you have any questions at the end, I'll try and answer your questions. I think it was our first speaker, Jerry, I believe, who was talking about the Constitution and the parameters of our water law is constitutionally set out in any unappropriated water of a natural stream in the state of New Mexico. It's considered to belong to the public, subject to appropriation for beneficial use, and subject to priority of appropriation. That is the main right. All this means is all the water in New Mexico belongs to New Mexico, the citizens. The measurement of how much water you use by beneficial use, how much you have historically used, and by the Constitution, prior appropriation, first in line is first in right. All right, you start that off, and I start that off because when you look at climate change, it changes a lot of this. Questions come up. Who has prior appropriation? Is it the public? Is it agriculture? Is it commercial use? All those type of issues that will come up. But before we start talking about some of these issues, I want to explain water administration from a legal perspective. As we all sit here and talk to each other, we begin to understand what we're each individually doing. When we talk to you about what we're doing, we have three components of water administration. We start off with the adjudication court, the office of state engineer, and then my level, which is the water courts. The office of the state engineer handles, of course, the middle section, but the adjudication court, which I'll define here for you, it's basically a lawsuit that declares where a basin is declared, and one judge determines what the final rights are in that basin. It sounds a little bit more simple than what it is, but basically all of the water in the basin is declared. The judge comes in this case, it's Judge Wexler. He determines who has what rights originating from when. Does that end the issue of who owns the rights and the legal issues? No, because as we know, water rights are always evolving. People are selling water rights, they're leasing them, they're sharing rights, so on and so forth. And so it's a very dynamic, fluid area here. Let's talk about the Office of State Engineer. You've had two speakers, know what they're doing. They're administrating the water based on permits. So if you need to use water, drill a well, if you need to change, transfer, you have to do it through the Office of State Engineer. So we end up on the third component of water administration in New Mexico, which is the water judges. I used to have a clip here at the main tech repairman, where they sit around and they're bored and they do nothing because adjudication judges, Office of State Engineering, are doing all the work. We actually do a lot of the work. We do appeals from the Office of State Engineer. We also do all disputes that affects the rights and liabilities of the parties when it relates to water. Folks, you would be surprised where all these water rights arise from. It can be as simple as a farmer passing away and leaving the farm to his two sons, 50-50. But they forget to split the water rights. So who ends up doing that kind of work? I do. Buying commercial properties, sometimes farms. You leave out who the water rights belong to, farmers subdividing their land, their small farms. And they forget to appropriate the water to a specific owner. That's where I can come in. And it actually runs the gamut. I do a lot of different things with water rights. Sometimes myself, I'm surprised about that. All right, big picture here, and I think we've all been discussing it here, is that we've got challenges with the administration of water rights that point out that 80% of water used in New Mexico is used by agriculture. By the way, this is across the board all over the western states. 80% of the water in the western states is used for agriculture. The municipal use is about 8.7. This is a little bit dated. I think it's about 2018. That's city water. And 12.3 is for manufacturing, mining, commercial purposes. I point that out because when it comes to administering water rights in a time of climate change, there's going to be a lot of focus in agriculture, because that's where the main amount of water is being used. Currently, agriculture contributes to 20% of the state's economy. And by the way, these figures are coming from the state engineers' water reports, 2018, and some of these other water reports. So it's not data that comes from a legal source. It comes from the Office of State Engineers. Sometimes it's a water data bank. And we have a lot of opportunity to make changes in the water administration use, and agriculture is a big part of it. I wanted to talk to you about two principal issues that we have with water administration, and we've got a lot of issues. The main issue we've got right now is the Texas versus New Mexico case. I'm going to give you a little bit of history real quick. The divvying up of the water started up in 2004, 2006. Basically, in Texas, New Mexico, and the U.S. decided to create a treaty or convention with Mexico. Mexico got, I think, I may be off a little bit, about 44% of the water at some point, with the U.S. receiving the rest and split between Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and I'm talking about the Rio Grande water. In 2017, 1917, 1918, EBID, District Number 1 in El Paso, those are the irrigation districts that came together, and they're the ones that operate and distribute irrigation water. We had the 2008 operating agreement between Reclamation, EBID, and El Paso. That didn't include the state of Texas, New Mexico. That created problems. New Mexico in 2012 filed a federal suit because of that operating agreement. And then in 2013, Texas came in and said, wait a minute, we got some problems here. And they filed the Texas versus New Mexico case, number 141. I don't have the time to get into it. I think there's a number of speakers who are going to speak about it. But generally what that means is there's a dispute over the water that comes through Rio Grande. Whenever that dispute is resolved, most people think it's going to end up in having New Mexico farmers decrease some of their use of groundwater. The argument made by Texas is, look, we're not getting enough of the Rio Grande water, and it's because the farmers are pumping the water and it's hydrologically connected. So when they pull up water from the aquifer, they're really using water from the Rio Grande that's supposed to get to us. In a nutshell, that's their argument. So when all of this is resolved, it may very well be that New Mexico will get less water. The folks up in the upper Middle Grande, above Elephant Butte, they'll probably have to cut down on their water use, because whatever water that's measured comes into the Elephant Butte Dam, and that's where it's measured, at least at this point. So somewhere in the future, we're going to need to make some adjustments. It is not us in the legal field. It's going to come through the decision makers of the Supreme Court, the states, the parties that will probably filter down to the office of state engineer. They're probably going to be required to set up new rules depending on how much and where there's going to be adjustments. All right. Now I'm going to put on my climate change judiciary hat. What you've got in front of me is the deep well extractions. In 1909, there were 543 deep wells. And it's interactive here, that's great. When you see it at, let me tell you, right at that point, that's 1909. And as you see it becoming bluer and bluer, that means there's more deep wells being placed into the aquifers that exist. By 2022, it's a little bit dated, we had 174,758 deep wells. That didn't include the wells for residential use that you see that might be 2 to 4 inches wide. So we've got a lot of straws in the aquifer. That is going to have to be dealt with because of climate change. The 2018 Water Plan for Office of State Engineer states the most glaring water supply shortfall is occurring in eastern New Mexico, where some communities have less than a 5-year span. Oops. That finger down. They're talking about this area, Clovis Portales. Currently, and I think the project that was finished this year, they had 100-mile pipe bringing water from Ute Lake down to Clovis to provide some water. It was about 2,400 acre feet, 24,000 acre feet, 12,000 of which would go to Clovis. I believe 8,000 to Portales, and some other acre feet went out to smaller communities. Portales sits on the edge of the Olacala aquifer, which is a huge aquifer that provides some water for America's breadbasket. We're talking about Nebraska, Kansas, some of those states. And this information that I have on this map came from the 2018 water plan. Shows the blue areas is the critically managed areas, which includes my area in Las Cruces. We've got some aquifers in there that have, you might call them life expectancies of 25 years. Some are 5 years, some are 30. I think Albuquerque, and I've seen figures between 100 years and 50 years. Doesn't mean that the aquifer is going to completely dry up. It's just that the aquifers are not going to be able to sustain the kind of activity that we have currently. They're not my figures. They're coming from the Office of the State Engineer. The state engineer has been warning about climate changes since I think the 2004 report. And take that with the fact that for the Western states since 2000 up to 2022, we had a mega drought. That is, by the way, Lake Mead. And you can see how much the water went down. So in the western part of the United States, we have some serious issues with water. This is taken from the climate change scientists at Woodhull, Massachusetts. I was part of the program that I was in to become a climate science judge. This diagram that you see up here is based really on economics. By 2060, America's breadbasket will shift to Canada. That's what's expected if nothing more is being done. And you can see if the area that is blue, you're going to see profit at 100%. And there's only a few blue areas. If you look really hard, you can see some there. You can see some, I think that's Oklahoma. If you're in white, then you're breaking even in agriculture. If you're in the brown, then you're breaking below 0. And you can see this is a breadbasket. Some places are going to be break even. By the way, all the gray area here, for example, in this area is desert. There's no real agriculture that you can quantify there. If it is dark red, then it is fallow. Now, Does that mean that we're not gonna have agriculture by 2060? No. What it means is there's going to have to be a lot of adaptations, a lot of adjustments in order to continue to have agriculture in a way that meets the needs of the US. If you're looking at the bread basket, the likelihood here is you're not going to see corn and soybean and wheat that is as dense as you would if you traveled now or 10 years ago. You may see 20% of it, you may see 30% of it, you may see 40% of it. But some of that wheat is going to be planted in southern Canada because it's going to be less hotter, more moisture, so on and so forth. The Ologala, I think, if I remember right, it had like an expectancy of maybe another 30 years or more, a little bit, not that much. They're doing a lot of sprinkling in the circular irrigation mechanisms. And so they're drawing down even more so on the Ologala aquifer. This came from, and I forgot his name, one of the economic scientists that we met at Woods Hole. If you can see New Mexico, largely desert, this little brown area is shaped like Diana County. That means we're going to have some problems economically with our agriculture. What are the current plans to administer New Mexico water? What's not going to come from judges. It's not going to come necessarily from lawyers, but it's going to come from all you people that are standing and sitting in front of me. It's going to come from research and also from policy. It's going to come from the OSC and the legislature. It's going to come from all the folks that deal with water. You folks set the policy, you provide it to the legislature, it becomes law. And all we judges do is we enforce the law. Sometimes we interpret the law, what we think it should be, and we look at the intent and the spirit. But by and large, we don't create the law itself. So what I've got here is taken from Climate Change in New Mexico over 50 years, Index and Water Sources, March 22nd, March 2022, Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources here in New Mexico. All regions of New Mexico will be affected by climate change. But the topographic complexity of the state will generate distinct impacts by location. The average temperature across the state will increase by 5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Precipitation will likely remain constant, although more variable from year to year. Some snowpack runoff and recharge will decline, stressing surface and groundwater sources. Surface water quality will decline. They will be communities will be more stressed because of higher temperature, greater aridity, leading to more wildfires, increased erosion, damage to soil, so on and so forth. I think that all assumes that we're not going to do anything different than what we're doing today. But as I've said, Ron, and as I've talked and looked at different articles, there's a lot of different things that we're doing nowadays to change. Adaptation is one. The research and development institutes of the universities are looking at developing strains. Plants are a little bit more drought resistant. We are looking at increasing and improving infrastructure to capture all the possible rainwater that we can. I was talking to someone from New Mexico State today, Jason, about soil conservation and ways to preserve and protect the soil, so on and so forth. There's no one magic bullet. It's going to have to come from all of us, and everybody, individual agencies, and even individuals is going to have to contribute in order to have New Mexico and the rest of the country adapt to the climate change that we're seeing. All right, so we have hope, and I'll define my kind of hope, and hopefully you can relate to it. This is a picture that I took off the Camino de Santiago. I've been walking that Camino for about 8 years. And there's a place called Castilla in the Meseta, which is in this north central plains of Spain. The terrain is somewhat hilly. It's very dry, kind of reminds you of New Mexico. And if you look at the fields as you're walking, you see nothing but gold, and it's all wheat. And one time I was walking, I was hearing a John Deere harvester clanking next to me. It was like rocks hit metal, and I thought, what is going on? Turns out that it was harvesting wheat. And I thought, there must be a lot of rocks up there. So I walked up there about 40 yards into the field. And I looked down, and that's what I saw. So I took a picture. There's probably maybe 20%, if you look at it as a square meter drain going out there. It's not irrigated because it's too hilly and dry. The wheat seed is basically what they've been using for thousands of years. It's adapted to heat, drought resistant, but it may be only 20%. In Spain, there are 48 million tons, I believe that's the right figure, of metric tons of wheat being produced each year. Spain has to import another 4 million tons metric wheat to be able to supply to its country. So it's pretty much self-sustainable at 20% of a metric square. What does that mean for the US? If we have to, in the Midwest, go back to planting wheat that is drought resistant and using only seasonal rain, we're not going to produce what we produce today. We're not going to be able to feed the world. But can we feed the US? Probably. There'll be changes, but I think there's some hope there. It's just not going to be looking like the way it looks today. We're not going to be feeding the world, but we are going to be sustainable. How sustainable? I'm looking at the people that are going to figure that out, give us the answers. I've got a lot more information. I'll open it up for questions in a moment. But if you really want to understand the legal aspect or perspective on administrating water law, how the law is created, why it was created, and what areas we made decisions in, I've got an article, Solving the Puzzle of the Water Court Structure and Process of Water Administration in New Mexico, printed and published by the University of Denver Water Law Review, 2021 fall issue. If you want to hear about me with my climate science hat on, then you can read my essay, Climate Litigation, the Future is Now, University of New Mexico, Journal of Natural Resources, Winter 2023. If you want to read that, you can look at YouTube. New Mexico's climate science judge visits you in 2622. They'll give you a lot more detail about what we've learned as judges in preparing for the upcoming climate changes. By the way, it's ongoing. Every year now, there's a new set of judges that are being brought in to be able to learn about climate change and how to prepare for it. And I believe we've got one more New Mexico judge, Justin Hunter, who is now also certified in climate science judging. Folks, I'm here to tell you that what I do as a judge is probably not familiar with it. But in the legal field, we're working as hard as you folks are working to try and figure out what to do with a diminishing resource, which is water. And water is climate change. I'll tell you very briefly, when I went to the New Mexico Climate Science Judiciary Program, I was sitting there for the first couple of days. It was in Reno, Nevada. And I was hearing all this talk about scarcity of water, droughts, all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking it's no different than what we've been doing for the last 100 years. Water has always been scarce in the Western states. None of this is new, not other than coastal regions and things like that. And I thought we've already been doing climate science, and we continue to do it. And I think we in the Western states, we're in a pretty good position to continue the work that we've already done and to be able to get our portion of the country to adapt to a future where there's even less water. So I felt real comfortable about my role in the climate science judiciary program. And I invite any and all of you to visit with any climate science judge that you've got to see what's going on. And I'll tell you what's going on right now in Mexico. The wildfires. There's also all sorts of lawsuits now against United insurance companies, the federal government, the towns, or the individuals that are responsible for the infrastructure in the area. And it all arises because of the wildfires created by climate change. State Farm Insurance is no longer insuring homes in the mountains, cabins. There's questions right now, what caused this? Was it climate change? Was it negligence? Did somebody just not clear out the vegetation in the trees near a line that fell on an electrical transmission that created the fire? Is it an act of God? Is climate change an act of God? Or is it now such a common phenomenon that it is negligence if you don't anticipate it and create a worse damage than what originally would have happened if you hadn't prepared for it? That's called mitigation damages. We are also having lawsuits, of course, over the water, Texas versus New Mexico. Climate change is ingrained in that because we have to figure out, how are we going to distribute this water, knowing that there's going to be a little bit less water in the future. Climate change is here. It's in this country. It's in the United States. When I first started the program, something like 3 years ago, we were still talking about being careful about climate change, big C, because it was political football. Nowadays, I'm sitting around with everybody from all walks of life, and when I talk to them, everybody understands climate change is here. And we have to adapt to it, and there's no easy solution. It's going to have to come from all aspects of government, society, educational institutions, but it's going to have to be a collective effort to resolve these issues. All right. I talked enough that I think I can maybe start asking questions, and hopefully I can answer your questions. Yes, sir.
I want to follow a little up on this issue of climate judges. To me, I've been in this one of it for over 50 years. And I find it unique that, especially in Mexico, the judges are having to do with water and climate change. They've dealt with that. New Mexico was a leader in groundwater management back in the 50s. But it's interesting that now we have potential for a climate court vis-a-vis a general court that looks at these issues. And I was going to ask you, what kind of cases are drawn to the climate judge? And I seem to understand that one of the issues might be whether the climate change is changed by natural occurrence or by man-made occurrence. And it would appear to me that under the natural change, that's an act of God. So it would appear to me that the climate judge, though in cases that might say the damage has been caused by an act of man. Am I reading it correctly? Whether the company or whoever is being accused of causing a problem can take into consideration mitigation issues. Is that what I see as the climate court, or is it broader than that?
You've been paying attention, yes, very much in what you've said. It's a little bit more broader than that, but before I start answering the question, let me just clarify. There's really no, with the exception of some courts in the Northeast, a few of them, there's really no established climate change courts which specialize in it yet. What this program, the National Climate Science Judiciary Program, is trying to do exactly that, is establish knowledge within the judiciary so that these type of courts can start being set up. And that's why I said a little while ago that sitting there as a water law judge, I understood what they were talking about, and this was not new to me. For the Western states, your water law judges really should be your climate science judges. Because we've been doing it, and we understand the issues. I've been listening about the water data, hydrological modeling, all these kind of things for years. 15 years now that I've been the water judge. So this is not new to me. Will we ever establish a climate change judiciary or court? Maybe, maybe not. But if we do, it's probably going to have to be in conjunction with the water law courts. Because as I've said, for New Mexico and many of the Western states, climate change is water. That's really the main effect. Now, going back to the kind of cases that we're seeing, and I spoke about it for a moment, what we're not seeing yet is anybody pointing out that this damage occurred because it was man-made. When I think about not man-made, because it was a natural disaster, it was an act of God. There could be a couple of reasons for it. I'm just assuming that there's reasons for this. Once you say that in this claim, it was an act of God, then we're going to have to draw at least half the people in this room to come in and testify. Hydrologists, climate scientists, we're going to have to draw in all sorts of people to either say this was an act of God or this was man-made. So far, what I'm seeing is a lot of people are handling it as a negligence issue. It was man-made. You didn't clear out the brush along the transmission lines. Tree fell, hit a transmission equipment, caused a spark. You know that it's been dry for the last umpteen years. That set off fire. It burned down all these homes. That's a negligence issue. That's easier and cheaper to deal with. But eventually somebody's going to say, no, it's worth the money to bring all these scientists in and say it's a act of God. And by the way, if you look at most negligence property claim policies, most of them have an act of God exclusion to it. I used to do insurance defense for 16 years back when I was a lawyer. And they all have it, but it's rarely used. Will that change? I'm not sure. A lot of what's being used, though, is the mitigation or adaptive failures. You didn't clear the brush, you didn't establish a burn, talking about southern Louisiana, New Orleans, the engineers didn't bring the berms up high enough to take care of that surge, so on and so forth. That's what we're seeing right now. We're also having a lot of litigation disputes over insurance. Again, most insurers, when we're talking about fires, are beginning to pull coverage out because it's just a big liability. Flood, most of the flood insurance right now in Florida, I believe about 80 or 90% of it is through FEMA or other governmental agencies. Very few private insurance companies are going in and insuring properties in flood-prone areas in the coastal regions because of that. Yes, sir.
Based on that, I understand what you're flagging at is that the courts, the Supreme Court state in Mexico, of course, determines sometime back in 20 or 30 years, whenever that was, that there were going to be cases that brought before the courts that dealt with water, and therefore we should have a judge that is knowledgeable and trained in water issues, which ultimately wound up with a water judge in the court.
Right.
And I think the courts are now saying we are going to be faced with climate issues,
Yeah.
just like we were with water issues. And let's start training our judges selectively in those areas. So when those issues come up, we go to a climate judge. Is that where we're heading? More or less?
More or less on some of the damage issues, but what we're seeing is that climate change is so pervasive, it's going into other issues. For example, you will see issues in domestic. Used to be that as a general principle, if somebody was getting divorced and they had children and they needed to share the children, that if somebody elected to go to Albuquerque because they got offered a great job at UNM or whatever, that was voluntarily. And so, a spouse, whoever is going to keep the children would have a good argument that that was voluntary. But what happens if climate change comes in and you are in Clovis, used to work as a manager at a farm, and farms have shut down? And the only job you can get now on farming is maybe in Diana County. Does the judge look at that child sharing agreement differently? What about the child support issue? If that farmer manager is unable to get a job, lost a job in Portales, is that individual excused, or does that individual have child support equivalent income? What's the word? Attributed. Because basically what law is nowadays, if you're a truck driver and you quit your job, right? You are charged child support to the same amount that if you had a job as a truck driver. Because you can get a truck driving job anyway. But what if it's a farmer in the eastern part of the state, no longer able to farm and make a living, and all their assets and equity is in eastern New Mexico? I mean, that's one issue. Is it climate change issue? Probably. Is it going to change the law at some point? It might. And you've got other issues, as I've talked about, insurance. How can you ever insure a cabin nowadays? And even if you get insurance, what are the exemptions? Those issues sort of go in civil cases. In the domestic cases that will come up, there'll be a lot of physical mobility. It may even come into the criminal field, and I can envision it if you've got Southern New Mexico correctional institutions and it is so hot down there in that institution that you start getting claims from inmates because it's too hot. You have that going on right now in, I think it's Mississippi. At what point is it climate change? At what point is it cruel and punishment? And if your state doesn't have the money to create new penal institutions up north, how are you going to handle it? That's probably something years up ahead. But those are the kind of things that come up in the law that we're going to have to be prepared for. And there may be other things that we can't even consider at this point. All right. Everybody's quiet. I don't know if you're bored or shocked. I always start my lecture by, I'm sorry, but this is your Debbie Downer lecture. I apologize. These aren't my numbers, so on and so forth. But I think that's what is so great about the climate judiciary program that we're doing, is it's getting judges to already think about this. Just like the kind of programs that you folks have, to start thinking about water data collection, creating good models, projecting, because what we've got, water, it's difficult. Whether you're on the science or the policy, the research, or the legal side, these are difficult issues that we're going to have to learn to deal with. All right, there's got to be another question.
Appreciate the presentation, very thought-provoking. As a lawyer, one thing I wonder about is our ability of our legal mechanisms to adapt to changes in water. For example, a couple of examples. One example is you might have a senior water user or farmer who has a crop, but over time, but crop needs more and more water because temperatures going up, the ET is greater. And overall, so what does that mean in terms of more junior water users? But more generally, as you point out, we have the fair appropriation doctrine, certain time, person right. But we don't really like that doctrine in New Mexico. We like the repartimiento equidistantly. And where possible, we try to come up with shortage sharing agreements. Oftentimes the prior right sets the table for a negotiation for shortage sharing. But we're gonna have more and more, we're gonna have surface water shortage, we're gonna have greater difficulty obtaining groundwater, just as you've been pointing out. And our legal mechanisms have recognized that there is this kind of alternative administration that allows for agreements that can be put into district specific rules and AWRM to try to deal with what I think is been recognized as more and more shortage. And I'm just wondering from a official decision-making perspective, what do you think in terms of what legal mechanisms are available? What do they need to be changed and made more adaptable? We have the system that goes Parteniento to prior sovereigns, and then we have this prior appropriation doctrine over 100 years old. We need to think about making those more nimble, or are there other ways to, or are they sufficient to deal with this coming challenge?
That's all a good question. You'll get a complete answer by next law review article. The impact of climate change on New Mexico's water administration. There's a lot to unpack there. As I went through my slide on the Constitution, that the right of prior appropriation came out in 1909. New Mexico was not a state until 1912. 1912, Henry Ford started making the first Model Ts. Everything really back then was agricultural. That's where your prior rights are. That worked, I think, great for about 100 years. And now, with climate change and the involvement of many other things, including municipalities, we're starting to adjust prior appropriation rights in different ways, different mechanisms. There was a case called Blount versus State Engineer, where a farmer in a small Apple Valley orchard started seeing all these homes being built on top of the ridges around the small aquifer. Filed suit against the state engineer and said, I have prior appropriation rights. First in time, I'm the farmer here. We were here since the mid-1800s. And you need to close down all of the residential wells. They are unconstitutional. And basically what the Supreme Court came back and said, they're constitutional. The legislature has a certain area in water code for residential water. They're entitled to use this water. Those are the type of things that are occurring, which really placed a priority on residential over agricultural. But even before that case, prior appropriation has been coming up less and less because of what you just said. Most people are negotiating, they're sitting down at the trade table, they're using prior appropriation as a baseline, and they're figuring out where should this water go to. I think that's kind of where we're headed. I'm a water law judge from the 7th Judicial District. Judge Reynolds, the late Judge Reynolds, issued or had a writing with the Natural Resources Journal, UNM, it's called Prior Appropriation, Is It Outdated? Something like that. Because with all these changes, we can't strictly look at prior appropriation. But those are the adjustments being done at the level of the administration with OSC, with the irrigation districts, with the soil and conservation districts, with the Mutual Water Users Association, individual litigants. I rarely see a case where somebody says prior appropriation. It's usually a case where people negotiate and resolve the cases. And I think that that's really what we're doing now, and into the future, we're going to have to do it that way.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, I didn't say it's outdated prior appropriation. I said there's an article on it, but you can see how it's evolving. Yes, sir.
I'll give you an example of where conflicts exist and will exist. 80% of the water in the purpose My old boss, Steve Reynolds, used to say, a 10% reduction in irrigation will more than double the use for non-irrigation uses. But that requires a change in purpose and place of use. The transfer of the water right. However, under New Mexico law, domestic wells can be drilled without any permit issue. So you get these domestic wells drilled today. And then there's an application made, say by the city of Santa Fe, or Albuquerque, to transfer a water right from irrigation to non-irrigation use. But the analysis indicates that that domestic well will be impaired. So therefore, you cut off the opportunity to move agricultural rights to non-agricultural rights. If that goes right to your point of the orchard and the development seed, it has a conflict in it. Because what happens is a domestic well drilled today in an area, in a municipal area use, can prevent the transfer of a water right for the betterment of the community, i.e. agricultural to municipal use, because the new location of pumping will affect that existing domestic well.
Right.
See the problem I have?
Yeah, I see the problem, and I see that problem coming up after Texas versus New Mexico's result. Because people are going to have to reduce the amount of water they take from underground. Probably the research will be better, water data will be better, and we'll be able to determine how much that reduction is going to be. Then the next fight is going to be precisely that. Whose water is being taken? Is it agricultural, being used for domestic for agricultural? And those are the kind of fights that we're going to be looking at. But there's going to be a lot of changes.
But, and you can bear with me, but should that decision be made by the legislature? Because our law does not distinguish between types of beneficial use. It just says beneficial use. However, some Western states give a priority of use, such as industrial, municipal, whatever it is. Do you think we're heading in a direction where the legislature might have to categorize priority of beneficial use?
It's going to have to be a hybrid. The problem is that things are changing so quickly for us. 10, 15, 20 years down the road, it's not going to be there before you know it. And the answers to adapting to how do we continue with agriculture, maintain it so it's sustainable at the rate that it is all within research and development and within those folks. How much water do we have to make it sustainable is all within water collection and hydrology. And ultimately, all of that goes to the legislature and they say, okay, we've got this much water, the best use would be this or that. They do the bills and the laws, and then we judges enforce it. But it's going to move very quickly.
Let me propose this to you, and I don't even want you to answer it.
I mean,
But with the state engineer,
right.
under criteria of public welfare, bench into a decision of approving that end use, notwithstanding the impairment of one domestic well, under the public welfare criteria of the administrative approach.
It's been hinted. From what you heard from OSC and the prior speakers is one of the parts of their mission to administer water is to make sure that the water protects priority rights while at the same time preserving conservation. So that tells you that impairment is going to be looking at the types of uses, probably at the determination of which one is more important than the other for this particular area here. And those answers are coming again from all of you. It's not going to be from us judges. You're going to tell us what to enforce. It may be different in one area of the state than it may be in a different area. But there's some challenges and decisions that are going to have to be made. I don't think it's going to be on our part, the judges. The only time that I foresee judges making decisions is to carry the intent and the spirit of what the law that exists already requires. It's conservation. You might be making a decision now, depends on the issue. But long-term, I am hoping that it comes out of R&D, that it comes out of the data collection information, that it comes out of agreements between irrigation districts and states and whoever else is involved. But it's gonna affect everybody, mutual domestic water associations, cities, counties, so on and so forth. And we'll just have to see what R&D legislature brings about as policy. We'll make our decisions from that. I can't give you a better answer than that. There's no magic bullet to climate change. It's going to have to be a collective effort by all of us.